I think that the Socratic ideal of self-knowledge is replaced among contemporary intellectuals by the Nietzschean idea of self-creation. The life of the intellectual is not a matter of finding out what has been inside himself or herself all the time. It's a matter of becoming someone new.
Yeah, I think the decision to become a philosopher, well, the decision is often sort of accidental for philosophers. They're driven by a passion for the kinds of questions and the kinds of answers that this history of philosophy has given to human societies.
What sorts of entities exist? How is the universe as a whole organized?
Questions about God, freedom, and immortality.
What holds this society together? What are the fundamental ideas? Is this society going anywhere?
What is happiness? What is time? What is being? What is fulfillment?
Freedom. Justice.
What is justice? And how can we achieve or fulfill the possibilities of that idea?
Those are questions that are always going to come up.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the American character, perhaps I have used that phrase, I don't know, obviously is some kind of insane simplification of something that's incredibly complex, you know.
It always worries me when there is the word "the" that prefaces any phrase. The American character suggests that there's one and only one American character.
It's just a way of saying that, you know, whatever the differences of our experience as Americans or whatever, there's also some kind of commonality. One aspect of the American tradition in philosophy is the attempt to reconcile the practical, feet on the ground, American salt of the earth idea with abstract thought.
You couldn't make any sense of America without understanding philosophy. Very frequently, the most significant progressive moments in American life is the coming together of a certain kind of practicality and idealism.
There's a tendency among Americans to want to solve problems.
Pragmatism?
Pragmatism.
I don't think that pragmatism would ever have existed without the USA. I just don't think it could have developed on the soil of European philosophy at that time.
I think our practicality had so much to do with the need to subdue a continent.
That sense of a direct approach of you know, here's the deal, let's face up to what the facts are, find out what the alternatives are, let's make some decisions, let's solve the damn thing. That's very American.
But I think there was a certain urgency about American experience that required you to shape what you know and what you think to be relevant to the situation.
What's so distinctive about the founding fathers is they're not ignorant. They know their Locke, they know their Hume, they know their Rousseau, and they're also very practical.
Franklin and Jefferson, of course, drew heavily on European thought. What they did is to bring their ideas to bear on their cultural activities.
Our counterparts in the Enlightenment were not doing that in their countries.
My history of pragmatism would be start off with Ben Franklin.
But Franklin in the autobiography, for example, I mean, why did he write that book?
What Franklin did was actions, and these actions led to a certain kind of persona or social persona that grew in America because he created this country, or helped create this country of practical-minded people.
But what he wanted to do by writing the autobiography was to spur moral effort. He wanted people to imitate him. So to me, you're kind of back to a kind of truth which is not simply stated, but to be acted upon. And you could certainly carry that forward, not only to the transcendentalists, but into pragmatism.
If one asks, what is American philosophy? Philosophy that corresponds to the American experience. But what is the American experience?
There's a dark and troubled side to the story of the American experience.
The American experience was a fairly broad notion of experience set against the British and also against Native Americans.
Which ranges from, of course, the genocide of native peoples and the slave trade to the Civil War. It's made us both a very naive and a very tragic people.
It's not the Anglo or European American experience, it just includes that.
Interaction was quite common between leading intellectual figures and native people. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was common. Most leading intellectuals had conversations with native people, lots of conversations with them, because it was a border situation across the whole of what became the United States. Jefferson was someone who routinely talked with native people who were at and around the place where he lived.
It includes the Native American experience, it includes the African American experience, and all of these things come together to form the context of insight and intuition and experience that gives rise to the philosophy.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is sort of the quintessential American philosopher as far as the world is concerned.
You couldn't have Ralph Waldo Emerson without the combined influence of all of those different traditions.
When I read, for example, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, we find these truths to be self-evident. They're not just self-evident in the sense that they're true, they're self-evident in the sense that they're impelling the revolutionaries to do something incredible. Had they lost the revolution, all of those people would have been strung up and executed summarily. They feel almost like a moral imperative to make these truths of all men are created equal and so forth and so on, to make them real in the world.
There is something in pragmatism, in American personalism, American idealism, and even in process philosophy that expresses the American experience. The thing that I would say characterizes that most adequately has to do with a certain, not only practicality, but a certain assumption about the inseparability of the way a person lives and the way a person thinks.
Philosophy is really the only practical subject matter, that it's really the only practical field of study. It's the only one that attends to questions about choice and action, about what should be done.
That's one of the features of philosophy, is that we're asking questions about how we should live our lives. And so it only makes sense that you should try to embody the answer to those questions in the way you live your life.
I think the way I've tried to answer some philosophical questions has changed the way I live. Or the way I live has changed my answers to philosophical questions.
There's a whole matter of American culture, which is so fascinating. Founded by philosophers, Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, obviously. And yet a deep aversion to disciplined philosophical thought shared by most people.
When I'm working with any set of texts in the United States, I certainly don't feel American. I don't think America as a culture is particularly philosophical. I don't think it's hospitable to philosophers.
France is something else. A philosophy book in France is a bestseller. Somebody like Derrida is literally a star. He sells 50,000 copies.
The philosophy of the frontier. The real men were the vanguard, forged their way, cut their way through wilderness. And then the women, children, and teachers, thinkers brought up the rear if they were included at all.
I don't know what this is like maybe in France. They're probably, I'm sure there are a lot of practical-minded people in France. It's not like everyone is like Gilles Deleuze or whatever, So I'm sure you can, alienate your parents by becoming a philosopher in France too, probably.
I would read my mother's Ebony magazines, and they had an advertisement about Cornel West is keeping faith.
America
and
is
I just
now.
saw this brother with a huge afro, and the title just hooked me. Keeping Faith, Race and Philosophy in America. Okay, race. I had no idea what this philosophy business was. But I was interested in reading things about race at the time. So I decided to order his book. But from that book, I became interested in studying the history of philosophy, and I came across the dialogues of Plato. And for several years, that's all I knew of philosophy, Cornel West and Plato. And I know that's an odd combination, but that was my introduction to philosophy.
Thinking, that was definitely stressed in my family. Sitting around and thinking about ideas and arguing about ideas
was, but I don't think anyone saw it as a profession. I think that switch was a little hard for some in my family. My father said this when I said I'll be a philosophy major. He said, this is a phase, you'll outgrow this.
My mother thought it was a phase that I would grow out of.
I think he was more worried about the practicalities of it.
My dad wanted me to become a TV repairman.
There have been some in my extended family who pursued things in an idealistic way but did not lead to self-support, and so we're not practical.
Because he thought people would always need their TVs fixed. But who the hell needs, the next move in the free will debate, you know what I mean? Nobody.
So sitting around and dreaming about ideas, there was a dangerous side to that.
Are you just drifting off into dreamland and in mere philosophy?
Examples. I have a cousin who's worked on a mechanism to sail icebergs down from the North Atlantic to solve California's water problems. My father himself patented a sonic cleanser of some kind that didn't actually take off. Another cousin who was brilliant but had money and kind of hung out and talked to people and drank too much and died early. And so there's that side to a life of the mind. And that same cousin did things like play nude golf and, a little eccentric. And there are members of the family that are eccentric.
My parents did not bat an eye when I came home and said I was going to major in philosophy and go to graduate school at the age of 18. They thought that was great.
My father was like, no, there's no way. Philosophy, that's not even a real job. What do you do?
I didn't have chores. I read all the time. I grew up in Chappaqua, New York and Princeton, New Jersey, which were two extremely affluent areas. I was spoiled.
He's going, that's not a job. Because he grew up all his life in manual labor, pretty much hard, back-breaking work at a lumber mill. And he didn't recognize what I was doing at work.
So I had what Aristotle said you might need or want for philosophy, which was lots of leisure. So I don't know if this is white male bourgeois privilege.
I was born in New York City in 1931. My parents were left-wing journalists associated at the time with the Communist Party.
I'm not sure when I got the concept of philosophy itself. Probably pretty early.
My father published a couple books of poems, worked in an advertising agency.
My mother was a philosophy professor at a time when there were virtually no women teaching philosophy in the United States.
My mother contributed articles to magazines like Harper's and Commonweal, mainly on race relations.
I grew up in quite a bookish house.
And so I grew up in a household that had books by Whitman and Emerson and James in the library.
My parents had copies of Plato and Nietzsche on the shelves, so I had read a little of both of those men before going to college.
The other kids had dens, we had a library.
I think that my father was puzzled by my decision to specialize in philosophy. He had nothing in particular against it. I think my mother was perhaps more pleased than my father. My mother's father had been a theologian, and she admired her father and thought that her son was more or less following in her father's footsteps.
I was in a theological seminary.
I was contemplating a career in the ministry, thinking I was going to go into the ministry.
I think a lot of people, certainly not all, but I think a lot of people who are interested in philosophy maybe began by being interested in religion. That's certainly the case with me.
I took some philosophy courses and decided that that was really what I wanted to do, and then decided, as I say, that the broad and crooked was probably a lot more fun than the straight and narrow.
Had questions about matters of religion, for example.
My father is a minister. My parents are very conservative, evangelical Christians, and I was brought up in a very conservative way.
Religion presses philosophy to stick with the big questions.
This is surely one of the more religious civilizations that's ever existed. I mean, people are very, very intense about their religion here.
Well, American philosophy in its first sort of formal garb came out of New England, and therefore it came out of this Calvinist background.
If we think about the important people in the American philosophical tradition, I'll mention, but won't say much about Jonathan Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards understood that he was engaged in philosophical not just theological dialogue, when he was working with the question of free will.
The person I start with is Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I would start with Emerson.
He was, I think, fifth in the line of ministers in the Unitarian Church.
They were driven by ideas to do things that their parents could never have imagined.
He decided that he couldn't be a minister, didn't want to be a minister.
Because he doesn't believe a lot of what that tradition tells him he ought to believe.
Even Emerson giving up his pulpit. I mean, he was part of the center, the Unitarian world. He's giving up this great job. He was the minister of the Second Church of Boston. Big deal, but he didn't want to administer communion, but he couldn't do it. He didn't hear that message, so he gives it up.
I think philosophy and religion are very closely related. I mean, I think essentially they address the same set of questions in many ways.
A lot of people, of course, turn to religion when they raise these issues, but many people turn to philosophy and ask questions that philosophers they hope can answer, and frequently don't.
I was studying philosophy and sort of became intrigued by this sort of what I at the time thought was this quest to be rational and reasonable that I found very attractive, since I had grown up in circumstances that I thought were pretty unreasonable, namely, racial apartheid.
I lived through the Second World War in Hungary, and a lot of people died, and there were some very tough times. I mean, there was actually fighting all around where we were. I was a little boy.
White supremacy and segregation required a lot of maintenance. Every white child had to be taught the terms and how to help maintain it through the way in which they would conduct themselves in being white.
I became acquainted fairly early in life as a result of that with death. And that raises questions even in a young child's mind as to what this mess is all about.
But we were not going to go to the same school, we were not going to go to the same church, we were not going to eat in the same restaurants, we were not going to sit in the same place in the movie theaters, we were not going to be on the same sports teams until, at least not before late 1960s.
So I was devoted fairly early in life to finding out answers to the big questions. Questions like, is there a God, and if so, how does he relate to us? What is the nature of man?
I was attracted by people who seemed to be making reasonable sense out of things, and so I was like, oh, okay, this can be helpful since I'm living with something that I think is pretty unreasonable and not very good.
I know that your project is about the American philosopher, or what is it to be an American philosopher?
The trivial answer, of course, is that if you're an American and you're philosophizing, you're an American philosopher.
There are lots of philosophers working in America who are Americans by birth or by naturalization who don't do what I call American philosophy.
You can be an American philosopher not necessarily standing right at this moment on the North American continent.
Sure, there's a distinction between American philosophers and philosophy in America.
There's a way in which an American philosopher pays attention to the tradition in a certain way.
Philosophy in America is anything that comes to these shores done by anyone who lives here and maybe holds a job in a philosophy department, although I don't think that's necessary. But those are not American philosophy in the normal expectation of the term.
Takes up certain commitments as interests or points of view to use, and also raises questions about things like place and so on. I mean, I think that these are things that mark a particular way of doing things, but there's no exclusive list. I think there are no necessary sufficient conditions for being an American philosopher.
I think geography makes a lot of difference to philosophy, even though we tend to overlook it or tend to leave that kind of thinking to the anthropologists and sociologists.
Philosophy in America, typically in the second half of the 20th century anyway, has been analytic philosophy, and it's been the kind of the dominant form. And then American philosophers are presumably those who have a deeper connection to a long-standing American tradition, and who therefore are, in a sense, more essentially American than are other philosophers. My dissertation project was a case study in the sociology of ideas. How do the social and institutional contexts in which intellectuals are situated affect the content of their intellectual work. So the question was, why do some philosophers become pragmatists when others become analysts and still others continentalists? I sort of take these to be categories which at least a large number of philosophers today use to describe their own work and the work of others, even though they recognize the intellectual inexactness of them.
There are some departments that are known as primarily continental departments.
I was educated first in continental philosophy, and that was mainly just the fluke of my being at DePaul University as an undergraduate.
Some that are known as still rather narrowly analytic.
Am I an analytic philosopher? That's a good question. Yes, I am by training, without question. I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, Chicago, called then Chicago Circle, which is a hotbed of analytic philosophy.
Historically, the analytic-continental divide is the most widely discussed. But I mean, there's also traditional American philosophy that preceded the rise of analytic and things of that kind.
So for purposes of my project, an analytic philosopher was someone who practiced a kind of technically rigorous and precise form of philosophy, typically engaged with questions in the philosophy of language, the philosophy of mind. A pragmatist was one who engaged perhaps critically but appreciatively with the American philosophical tradition. And a continentalist was someone who worked on any number of continental figures. For at least a number of the people in my study, these were intellectuals who thought of themselves as in some way distinctively American, as maintaining this sense of continuity with not simply an American intellectual tradition, but with a cultural tradition.
It is a way, I think, of marking that philosophy is a cultural activity. It's not something that takes place in a vacuum. It's something that people do. These are not detached ideas.
I think philosophy always comes from somewhere.
I think this is less a geographical way of thinking and more a cultural way of thinking.
It's a project of individuals and communities who have a particular life.
There is an intimate connection between philosophy and geography, or less abstractly, thought and place.
And a particular location.
Thinking is essentially contextual.
And a particular time.
It's essentially bound to time and place.
And a particular place in the land and in the world.
Place becomes a conscious and problematic topic for me, as well as for a number of other thinkers, academics, philosophers. We tend to be more nomadic than perhaps people in many other professions.
One thing I've found disturbing in my life is that I've had to move every 4 or 5 years throughout my adult life.
So the notion of settling into a new place, leaving places with which we've become quite attached, is part of our lived experience.
I'm packing up books to take with me to teach in Southern Illinois. I'm going down there to teach. SIU has one of the best American programs in the country in the Dewey Center. I'm looking forward to the adventure of teaching the new program. It's a long ways from family.
And so I myself really crave a connection to a place.
I don't think there ever has been a timeless, placeless, value-free, voice from nowhere kind of philosophy.
Like here, I've been planting trees, and I feel so, to me somehow that is that brings me into a connection with this place, to plant these trees, to nurture them, watch them grow, and so on. But I've never been anywhere where I could, do that so that the tree would reach some significant, height or age in my presence, And I have a deep craving for that sense of home and continuity and place in my life, but I haven't really been able to achieve it.
For many of these philosophers, pragmatism became a way of doing a form of intellectual work that really resonated with their sense of self, and gave them a sense of authenticity in their intellectual work.
The name that has managed to stick is pragmatism.
This is not to say that they're all pragmatists, because they're not.
So there's nothing peculiar about the idea of a philosophy that's expressed in America by people who share a certain set of problems, opportunities, loyalties.
But it's also something that's probably lost because this is being lost because, or has been lost, maybe it could return, but because American philosophy, like much world philosophy, has become so embedded in the academy and so cosmopolitan.
But there are many people who really do think, particularly since philosophy has become such a profession, that there's nothing distinctively American about what professional philosophers do. They could just as well be living in Pittsburgh as they could be living in Berlin.
There's no real distinction between American philosophy and British philosophy, say, as it's practiced at the University of Pittsburgh or Harvard or something like that. This detachment of philosophy from experience or of mind from body or whatever is something that is very much encouraged by an academic context for this stuff. If you just work in your little office with your big shelves of books or whatever, that's a lot different than, Thoreau out at Walden Pond or something.
The drawing of distinctions by members of intellectual communities is not a politically neutral enterprise, right? I mean, one draws distinctions in different ways to justify one's own projects and interests, and this is a way of doing that. It's a way of in a sense, calling into question the authenticity of work done in the analytic tradition, for example.
Analytic philosophy, which is the dominant mode of philosophy in the Anglo-American world, academic world, dominant by numbers, is very much modeled on science. Sometimes despite themselves. Philosophers in the 20th century love to model their investigations and their thinkings as if they're in a lab and as if they have they've come to an aha moment and proven something. And everyone has to stand back and applaud and be wowed. And yes, we've new knowledge now.
Many philosophers, I think, like to see what they're doing as somehow free of space and time.
Analytic philosophy tends to downplay the situatedness of knowledge pursuits, including philosophical pursuits. That is, where it occurs in history, who the person is that pursues it, much like the sciences do, for good reason. That is, this quest for objectivity and depersonalization, this fear of relativism, that it's just my opinion, and the only reason I'm saying this is because I'm located in this particular country or time.
I don't find the notion of an American philosophical tradition very useful. If you try hard enough, you can spin a story about an Australian philosophical tradition, a Belgian philosophical tradition, an American philosophical tradition, but I'm not sure that it's really worth doing.
Well, as usual, that's a pretty offhand and thoughtless remark. He's just making a comment that there isn't a core essence, and that's a kind of tired point.
We don't talk about Belgian philosophy, that's right. But we do talk about American philosophy, and we talk about German idealism. And it's not that there's no French idealism, but German idealism is a certain brand, and it's identifiable as it grows out of Kant. And we do talk about ancient Greek philosophy, and that's something relatively identifiable. But this is a useful shorthand way of referring to a certain way of thought.
I think the only relevance of geography to philosophy is that there is a sort of apostolic succession of professors in the universities of a nation, and you can trace the genealogies of the various generations of philosophy professors back through time. But that succession of who taught philosophy in the major universities of a given country doesn't determine the course of philosophy in that country, because philosophy is imported from other countries all the time.
Obviously, you had to build initially on foreign sources. I mean, these people came, Peirce and Kant and James and Hume and Edwards and Locke. I mean, there was surely a background. We didn't start from scratch, so to speak. But I do think that When the pragmatists got started, there was a new sense of thinking for ourselves without the concern of what other people abroad think about it. Now that's very important. Many people, American philosophers, particularly professionals, have been so concerned about whether it's would pass muster in Oxford, that kind of thing. James and Peirce didn't give a damn about that.
I don't think there's anything like a national character or the character of a people that influences the reception of philosophical ideas. Philosophical ideas are confined to 1% of the population, and they tend to be cosmopolites who are not easily identified with their country.
There is another way of looking at this. It's interesting that particularly figures like Dewey and James thought of themselves as not just doing philosophy in America, but there was something distinctively American, and they were influenced by American tradition. You can look at philosophy as it has been practiced in America and really try and see are there certain types of themes which are characteristically American or been influenced by the American type of tradition. I think that there is a very strong tradition of distinctive philosophizing in America, and that there are characteristic interests which have been predominant in America, so I take that quite seriously.
The interesting question is whether that philosophizing, that thinking critically about our own situation in the world, is thematically united in some way.
So the question is, what are the primary themes, affinities, interests, ideas that are pervasive in American history of American philosophy? And I'm just going to answer without elaboration. Freedom, individuality, community, risk, justice, oppression, openness, possibility, God. If I take that list and I go back and I put one text, one phrase, one idea to underwrite all of those themes, I would call it the drama of experience.
If you know something about James, William James and James's life,
He was more or less a neurotic wreck for a good deal of his 20s and 30s.
he talks about kinds of religious experience that are deeply troubling and deeply problematic.
Begin to see this pattern, rejection of old ways of thinking based on some new insight, a coming together of ideas from Hegel, from Darwin, and from the new experimental psychology. And all of this comes together at a certain point in time that is also politically very interesting because it coincides with the progressive era in politics in the United States. And here we get Dewey's work with Jane Addams at the Hull House in Chicago.
She goes into the project of establishing social settlement and over time realizes how foolish she'd been about certain expectations about the community and what they needed. But as soon as she started listening to the community as they came in to talk with her and the other folks at Hull House, they began to realize there were things they could do, they just weren't the things they thought they could do to start.
This is a kind of hardy band of people who, William James had a sense of this, the kind of hardihood that it takes to do really challenging inquiries.
If you're not experienced, this is a Jimi Hendrix question, if you can't answer yes to the question, are you experienced, you're going to be very limited in what you can do in American philosophy, because it's the experience that drives the questions, and it's the experience that drives the answers.
Certainly Peirce's life had a tragic quality to it, but if you look at Peirce's actual theory of inquiry, you realize that most inquirers are destined to be wrong, that it's only in the long run, that after constant failures, that the general shape of truth begins to emerge for Peirce.
Santayana is a fascinating character.
He's a very odd bird. He was only 9 years old when he came here, and he never really felt like an American.
There's a deep pessimism in his work.
He thoroughly became an American, but he didn't feel like it.
His father died when he was 9. He and his brother had to share a coat. in the sense that one day one would wear it to school and the other day another would wear it to school. He created a new profession for himself, or entered a profession that was developing that. So money was always an issue for him.
If one wants to create great art, great philosophy, or even good art, good philosophy, you have to be experienced in the world. You have to have done things, you have to have seen things, and you have to bring your writing to bear on this, to interpret, to create and develop it. Without that, you're lost.
Black Elk, his near-death experience.
I know that she herself regarded
What was his place
the
as a
Haymarket
member?
riot and the execution of the martyr as a radicalizing experience, or a moment when she came to awareness of
Until he
anarchism,
was 30, he was
of the
still
injustice of
a
the
believing Christian and tried to
Passionate.
arrange his
and ended up being
thoughts around
probably the most notorious
truth of
person in the United
Christianity.
States of her era.
To his experiential details.
The crucial American philosophers with whom I deal, at least, are celebrating life. The pragmatists and the naturalists take life to be the most dramatic manifestation of reality we have experienced. Irrepressible vitality is inherently unpredictable. I take life to be, by its very nature, something that is at bottom untamable. And in that sense, life is wild.
But this also takes me back to the question of the relation of place or land and thought. And it was very clear, if you look back on this history, that it was very difficult to box up this American frontier for these Europeans. The world looked entirely open to them. It looked possible to do pretty much anything with hard work and some good luck. And so this notion of possibility became very quickly a text that underwrote what American culture and thought was going to do. The key issue is growth, openness, possibility. Now, the key factor here, as William James was one of the few to point out rather repetitively but importantly, if you have that kind of spontaneity and freedom and possibility, you also run the risk of severe loss. And James would always say, this is a riskful environment, and my freedom comes at the cost of pure loss and absolute responsibility. This became the place where you could take some chances. And it was recognized as being okay. It wasn't shot through with angst.
Are there risks incurred in doing philosophy?
You mean like getting killed? Like Socrates or Bruno? There are risks in doing anything.
Boy, the question of whether philosophers are heretics is an interesting question, because Socrates is our first so-called heretic who gets killed, so the story goes, for quarreling with the conventions of the culture.
It's almost a truism to talk about the philosopher in exile and both belonging and not belonging to the community. But if the philosopher is about destabilizing the inertia of habits such that some redirection could occur, defenders of a well-ordered society might be resistant.
I think there is a sense in which most folks who are known as philosophers have had that kind of edge.
Defenders of a particular society that persists because of the inertia of habits might be very, very concerned.
In, I believe, the Great Speeches of 1939, if you look there, you'll find a very thinly veiled reference to Dewey, in which Mortimer Adler indicates that, in his view, Dewey is even more dangerous to democracy than Adolf Hitler, and that the United States will not, or in fact the world will not be safe for democracy until professors of this ilk are liquidated.
There is a way in which I think American culture identities do view themselves as being outside of something, a kind of maverick culture. Because it's not just being on the outside in the sense of having been excluded or banished, although that certainly happened, but it's usually on the outside while doing the good work or working on behalf of virtue, a virtuous outsider. Which is interesting, because that then would suggest a kind of prophetic outside. Right? The prophet is the one within the community who tries to bring it back to its ideals. There's a very interesting way, and I never really thought about it before, in which that suggests a kind of philosophical bearing. This is sort of, some people call this rugged individualism historically, and what that seems to mean is it's a kind of agrarian autonomy where one is a law unto oneself and one's going to go one's own way. But you have to do it in a hard-knock world. Given the pressing realities of life, I'm going to find my path through it.
I've always wanted to teach a class on philosophers who were either kicked out of their country or killed by their country. I do think it is a risky profession.
When you think about what Socrates did in The Myth of the Cave, is he initially made the folks unhappy.
Even though Socrates himself, by his enemies, was called just another sophist, he wasn't just another sophist.
They were doing okay in their shadow world. And he comes and releases them, and they are not happy at this. They are forced to look into this bright light, the fire. It hurts their eyes. They're dragged, basically, up the path to the world of forms. And so this is a very unpleasant, in many respects, experience.
He resisted being a well-paid and popular teacher of the young. He, in making them successful as the world measures success, he was accused of corrupting the youth. Well, he certainly disturbed the youth Euthyphro would be a perfect example, disturbed the youth with these terribly demanding and disturbing questions that he asked.
I think philosophers no longer say the kinds of things that people don't want to hear. I think philosophers become completely conventional. I think for the most part, academicians are scared people. They're afraid of their shadow. They're afraid of administrations. They're afraid of everything. They'll speak in bold terms about this and that. They're great liberals in their classrooms. But when it comes actually to doing anything about it, they tend not to do much. And when they hold opinions, they tend to hold the opinions that other academics hold. It's very rare to find a Socrates today.
And I tell students, there's some risk to thinking, period, because it will make you maybe not as comfortable with your friends or your family as you once were, because once you start thinking and thinking for yourself, you'll end up coming to conclusions that differ, and that can be uncomfortable, and that a lot of people are afraid of that.
Some friends I've lost because of this, which has been somewhat tragic. My being too critical or their being too dogmatic, you grow apart.
So I think that's one of the biggest risks, and it's a risk that many students don't feel they want to take, and that's one of my jobs, is to help them be willing to take that risk. I often have students come back from a semester break saying things were not as comfortable at home when they brought up certain things they'd been learning about. But I think that's an important risk that everyone needs to take, especially living in a democracy, because democracy is only going to work if people are thinking critically and forming opinions with some autonomy and thoughtfulness. And so but it is. You can get into trouble. You can get into trouble with the media now.
Now that's not mainstream, that's extremism. And it ought to be thought of as such. It ought to be portrayed as such.
You can literally get into trouble with our government from time to time. That risk hasn't gone away, and it's not non-existent just because you live in the United States.
And so here it is. Now you may never have heard of Central Washington University. I hadn't either. Now this paper happens to chronicle a lecture and report on a lecture given by a woman named Erin McKenna, who is a philosophy professor at Pacific Lutheran University. Look, there she is.
I gave a paper at Central Washington University. It was an invited talk by the philosophy department, and the title was Women, Power, and Meat. And it was comparing two books and was basically arguing that the process of objectification in factory farming for animals and in pornography for women was a similar form of objectification, and that if you had a problem with one, you should have a problem with both, and these would be practices that needed to be looked at critically.
From balconies, you can look across entire rooms of assembly, or rather, disassembly activity.
But the student newspaper wrote up an article on it and said that I argued that men eat meat in order to dominate women, which I had never suggested, but that got sent to Rush Limbaugh, who then held up the newspaper on his then TV show, talked about it on his radio show, and then that night brought it onto his TV show and used it as a forum to go after all of feminism. I was a militant vegetarian and a feminazi.
This is where liberals have gained control. Liberals control the institutions here, even though it may seem to some that liberalism is on the wane. They still have tenured professorial positions at major universities.
Used it to say this is how liberals were taking over the academy. I was not a tenured professor. He referred to me as a tenured professor, inflicting this on my students. This was outside the classroom, was totally voluntary, free lecture. When I tried to write and say what I actually argued or what the situation was, there was no response. And from his viewers, they would say, no, Rush said, you said this, rather than actually even wanting to read the paper. So I got to feel that side of the media, but I found no venue to respond effectively. Was it a positive or negative experience? I don't know. But it was a tough one, and it led to things like people saying, as long as she teaches at PLU, we'll never give money, or my daughter won't go there. And luckily I had a president and dean who supported academic freedom. I think in some cases that would be another risk that a philosopher could end up facing. That's why tenure is important, is actually to help with that risk and let people really debate these ideas in a free fashion.
The notion that it's that this precarious and riskful world is somehow a bad thing didn't dawn on Americans very early.
To Control Tower, we are about to take off on the highway of tomorrow. Stand by.
To call Americans optimistic or something is just, would be like the most cliched imaginable expression. That's also not ridiculous.
In many cultural fronts, Americans are seen as optimistic people filled with hope.
The deep love of the future. Americans are deeply interested in shaping the future. That's what it's all about.
Strange shapes will rise out of the night.
I think this is so deeply ingrained in the American mentality that there's no alternative to it, no viable alternative.
It will be like a star burning bright, lighting our way with
I do think that there is something almost pathetically hopeful in the American philosophical tradition.
I mean, Americans have always been accused of being optimistic.
But it's not limited to the academic philosophers of the American philosophical tradition. There's a reason why Hollywood endings are Hollywood endings.
I think our geography is part of the source of our being a forward-looking people, always looking to the frontier, always looking to the empty spaces that we perceive as empty. I mean, never mind the native traditions and the native people there. We conveniently ignore that, but we tended to look to the West as a place where one can always escape. So that in the frontier thesis of Turner, I give a lot of credence to, and I think this is part of that optimism, the idea that there's that there are greener pastures and somewhere out there.
Optimism in the United States comes at a very high price. The price is that of a certain kind of psychosis.
Each enterprising achievement brings wonderfully new ways of life at our fingertips.
I think that the cult of progress, the idea that every new technological innovation, or the idea that every new advance is automatically an improvement on the human condition, becomes a kind of psychosis through which we make a deal with the devil at the crossroads. And the deal with the devil is this: if we will ignore the ultimate finitude with which human experience is riddled, shot through, if we will turn our back on finitude, then our reward for that will be hope.
I think the pragmatists are right about this, that life is identical with hope in one sense. That is to act at all is to believe that my actions can come to fruition. Without that belief, action would be ridiculous.
To say, like, for example, that pragmatism is a perversely optimistic philosophy, it seems to me, overall.
I think that American philosophy, like America more generally, is sometimes viewed as optimistic.
And I think there's an element of truth in that. They saw the possibility as things to be done, not as a foreclosure in such a way that if they took any step they might mess up the universe.
There is a tendency, and I really do believe Dewey is guilty of this in the end. Although he says some things to the contrary, but in the main, problems are there to be solved.
I seem to have very much the interest that Americans typically have in resolving problems.
It's an irreducible fact of human existence. We die.
I don't want to wallow in the problems. I want to resolve them. I want to make them go away.
I don't see an answer to that. Why are we born here only to die? It's not a problem to be solved. Any philosophy that tries to answer that, I think, is bogus.
It's not entirely clear to me that the representative thinkers, to use Emerson's expression, the representative American thinkers are nearly as optimistic or committed to the ideal of progress as either Americans in general or as these thinkers are portrayed by various intellectual historians. So I think that there is a much more critical, cautious attitude displayed by even the seemingly most optimistic of philosophers, John Dewey, toward an ideal such as progress.
I think that one of the things that's true about the American philosophical tradition is that the common distinction between optimism and pessimism is just rejected. We think of optimism and pessimism as pretty much occupying the whole field. You're either an optimist or a pessimist. I think that it's more accurate to read writers like Emerson and James and Dewey in their language as meliorists.
Is James's distinction that he made at the turn of the 20th century between optimism, which is a guarantee of good things to come, pessimism, which is a guarantee of bad things to come, and what he and Dewey called meliorism.
A meliorist, I take it as somebody who says, I don't know, it's not fixed yet, I can't see, I don't have a crystal ball, the future's not set. Will it be good or bad? That's unclear. But my action, my hard work, my strenuous effort is called out in order to make it better than it otherwise would be.
And that's really the attitude that drove American culture, and I think in many ways continues to.
So is there any philosophical progress?
I don't know what it actually means to talk about progress in philosophy.
The very form of the question, is there progress in philosophy, and what could that possibly mean, is really interesting. Well, that's a philosophical question. What does progress mean in knowledge?
The ways in which philosophy progresses are difficult to really itemize.
But I was just saying to my class that some of the best philosophical ideas occurred many, many hundreds of years ago. I think Aristotle has some pretty fantastic ideas. Very, very fine ideas in philosophy. And I can't think of a current philosopher who's got ideas in that abundance, of that quality.
Do we know more than Plato did? Well, it's funny to say that we do, because Plato's answers to some of these questions are still on the table. They're still a competitor in the conversation. You may not think they're right, but to say they're not is to engage with them. And so if there's progress, it's very slow. That means we are barely taking a step after 2,300 some odd years.
I think you're always going to have to go over some of the same ground in philosophy, and in that way you don't improve, you just, or maybe the improvement comes in learning how to handle the same sorts of issues again and again. Issues like how to live my life, or what is justice.
Yes, the quarrel between Rorty and Putnam is really intriguing.
every philosopher feels, and this is to the credit of analytic philosophy, that if analytic philosophy didn't live up to this great dream that the new science and the new logic would solve philosophical problems, that didn't pan out. Nevertheless, we learn more about why and how difficult they are and why they're so difficult.
Putnam represents the pole of thinking which says we're making slow progress towards some kind of a valid and adequate picture of all the philosophical questions. The classic questions are still with us. We're still working at it. There have been a lot of false starts, but we are making progress.
The reason I was so excited by philosophy is that it seemed to make progress and find answers, at least provisional answers, to some of these objects of curiosity that were driving me crazy at the time.
And Rorty says, nonsense. The game is over. The older conventional view that we could answer the questions that classic philosophy had posed is just a kind of self-deception. Philosophy in that sense is over. The idea that philosophy is a science which would finally answer the question of knowledge, the question of reality, the question of moral values, all things of that kind, that's all gone.
I think that since Hegel, a lot of philosophers have agreed with Marx that what you want to do in philosophy is to move history along in a certain direction, to change the cultural climate in certain ways. And this is a task which is different from seeing things under the aspect of eternity or seeing the necessary structure that lies behind contingent historical change. So a great deal of the battle among philosophers nowadays is between historicists who would like to think of themselves as making certain changes in society and culture easier, and other philosophers who see themselves as solving problems, trying to solve problems which have been here ever since Plato and haven't changed since Plato's day.
One has to have a temperament. For example, when a physicist, I won't identify him, he's not a famous physicist, but I used to have lunch with fairly often, he wrote me a letter recently in great distress because one of his, maybe grandchildren must be, wants to study philosophy. And he said he take a Kant course, and he said, I looked at Kant and it looked to me like sheer nonsense. Now the idea that just being trained in experimental physics meant he could look at a few paragraphs of Kant and decide that it's all nonsense. I mean, that kind of arrogance seems, I would call a failure of sensibility. You could also say a failure of temperament.
My students, as soon as I tell them that these questions cannot be answered in any decisive way, often respond with great, puzzlement. Like, so why even go after them?
James once put it that the person you meet who has no philosophical temperament at all is the most inauspicious of characters that you might want to hang around with. They're just uninteresting.
When we read philosophy, we have our favorites, and other people we like, we find ways of linking them up with our favorites. Dewey's an interesting favorite of mine because he links up with other favorites of mine, in more than one. I mean, here's a guy who writes a lot about logic and inquiry, and he's really writing about character development. One of the key things is to be open in the situation. This does require a certain kind of openness, a certain kind of open-mindedness. But man, that's hard work. Sometimes we misplace this when we talk about, I have no presuppositions or I have no biases. And we think that objectivity is achieved by erasing the subject. It's not. It's about building up the subject. It's the hard labor of the subject to be receptive. And there is a kind of active passivity there. And it's an acquired skill. It's tied to the power dynamics of the social situation. But it is an affective state, and it's intimately tied to character and to habit. And I think it's something that one needs to work at. Here I think Dewey and Emerson are close. And I think James too. I mean, I think when Dewey talks about habit and James talks about temperament as a kind of inherited set of habits that we're not limited by, but they are the cast of our character. You certainly get temperament straight in The Iron Wire of Temperament in Emerson.
I found that certain philosophical practices and activities shaped my character in ways that I wasn't happy with. I recognized that certain philosophical tasks changed your personality and led you to be one kind of person and another kind of person. And I wanted, when I decided I was going to focus on one philosopher, I wanted to make sure that this philosopher I'm going to let into my brain on a regular occasion, and I'm going to really work hard to try to understand, was someone that I actually wanted in my brain. So I became very concerned about how it is that this philosopher lives his life, what sort of things are important to him, and because I wanted the things that were important to him to be important to me, not simply in terms of these are doctrines I agree with or disagree with, or views or arguments I agree or disagree with, but this is the kind of person who I'm willing to have shape my character as I try to understand his views.
I remember a man that I didn't know very well, rather well known in philosophy, but he initiated a society for exact philosophy. That was his idea. That was the name of the society for Exact Philosophy. I found it very comical that anyone would think that philosophy could be exact. That suggested that it was some kind of science, which I think is misguided, to be honest.
Philosophical questions are the questions that don't admit of scientific or empirical solution. There's no way to get, virtue into the laboratory and prove that it's this rather than that. One thing about philosophy, it seems to me, is radically open-ended. And it never needs to stop. It needs never to stop.
Philosophy is a kind of venture. You make suggestions about how the world could be looked at, how you could think about it. A proposal of how to see the order of the world. I think that's what we do.
The open-endedness of philosophy is tremendously exhilarating.
Let me cite, I don't know if you're going to get to talk to Hilary Putnam. He makes a distinction which is really there in the classical practices. Good philosophy combines two different sorts of things. Vision, some type of vision, with a certain amount of argumentative finesse. And if you don't have a sense of vision, it can turn into just pedantry. And if you just have as I say, if you just have argumentative finesse in that, it can become terribly boring. And the art that makes a distinctive philosopher is the capacity to combine the two in an interesting kind of mix.
And some of these proposals are fruitful, and some are simply charming and interesting, or offbeat, or heterodox, or crazy, whatever they may be.
I think originality is what one looks for when one looks for books to read. You don't look, or at least I don't look, for clever solutions to old problems. You look for people who sweep the old problems off the board and set up the pieces in a new way.
But in doing this, I think we improvise new connections which other people hit on, see are rewarding, and then begin to use in some more organized way.
Which is not to say that any answer is as good as any other answer, you know what I mean? So it's in this space between decisive answer, decisive refutation of a previous answer, and something where just half-assed anybody can say whatever they like, because that's not quite true either,
Other philosophers then come along and they begin to improvise in a new direction. There's no end to how many different ways we could do this.
I believe Emerson says, beware when God lets a philosopher loose upon the earth, because everything becomes held in question at that point. Creative ideas, genuinely creative ideas, are far more powerful than any one individual can hope to comprehend. And philosophers create ideas, and ideas are probably the single most powerful force in the world. It's just that we don't recognize their force so easily. We think of force as the bomb that explodes, not the idea that makes somebody drop it on somebody else. The story about the first atom bomb going off in New Mexico, in Alamogordo. Oppenheimer, when he saw the thing go off, and he quotes the Bhagavad Gita, I have become death, destroyer of worlds. And that's a possibility for an idea.
Salisbury, Maryland.
I would like to say that I am a committed Christian, and I know Mr. Starkwell probably will have a hard time with that, but I am. And we do not believe that babies are to be hurt or anybody on purpose. God has things happen. But if you don't believe in God, how can you possibly blame it on God? And also, Connie, this man was on here on July the 4th, and it's upset me so much. He was so anti-American. And I wish on some days that you would have people who really love America and want us to continue to exist.
Are you anti-American?
No. I don't think so.
The term America itself is an evolving, changing word. I don't know if I want to associate my thought with a nation state, a contemporary nation state, or again with this cultural milieu, which I think remains anti-intellectual, and this has been a part of its cultural founding from the get-go. If you think of de Tocqueville saying, if they didn't have their goodness, this country would be up the creek, because they're not that reflective. They say we're individuals, but just don't step out.
I think de Tocqueville captures something about a strain in American culture and thought.
There's something about philosophers that troubles people. I assume that's part of the reason Socrates ended up drinking hemlock.
I am quite taken by his characterization of Americans as individuals who are shut up in themselves, who presume from that vantage point to be able to judge anything and everything, the world, in themselves.
If you just keep asking questions, and you keep asking them sincerely, and you don't accept halfway answers, or there's always some further question that trails upon the answer, it doesn't take some people long to conclude that you're not a person of goodwill.
And also, why don't you put under syndicated columnist, won't you say his professor at Dickerson College, so people can know where he comes from? I would say God has his students, but since he doesn't believe in God, that doesn't make any difference anyway. Thank you so much.
I think there are a number of risks in becoming a philosopher in America.
I talked about being marginalized.
I don't think any of them are dire risks, with the possible exception of the Socrates story.
We may be well known within the small circle of non-analytic professional philosophers, but pretty well marginalized.
But nevertheless, it remains a place where if you want to be a philosopher, go be one.
Yeah, on the margins of the margins.
Now, there's a risk that accompanies that, and that's being ignored.
You know, one of the things that I can do at a party without any trouble at all, if I want to be left alone, what I can do is tell people what I do. And they never bother me, you know. So you sort of say, well, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I teach at the university. That's okay, you know. And sometimes they say, well, what do you teach at the university? And I say, well, I teach philosophy, and that's pretty much it.
Philosophy?
Yeah.
I couldn't do that.
Well, philosophy, the definition of philosophy given to me was the lover of truth.
That's just sitting around wondering why things exist, but you really don't have to, because all you got to do is just use it.
Maybe it's not true, I don't know, but it sounded good to me at the time.
Use what?
Whatever it is you're thinking about, what's it all about? Thinking about it too much really wears down the batteries.
I just know that, like, if they, once they have a license plate,